We are here to brew the Citra all grain brew kit from northernbrewer.com. You can see some of the equipment that I have. I've got a mash tun here, and we'll look inside that shortly. I've got some Irish moss. I've got some pH stabilizer. You may be able to hear a little bit in the background that it's actually raining out here. We have a cistern at our house and it collects rainwater, so our water is very, very soft, so it needs as much help as it can get. So we have some pH stabilizer. And then look at all the hop additions, because this is an IPA. Okay? All those little green bags are hops additions. And the grain came crushed. I don't own a grain crusher. I have a local homebrew store that can crush the grain, but I'm still in the process of learning what I'm doing. This is my first 5-gallon all grain batch. Okay? Now, some other things that are here. We have the Big Mouth Bubbler from northernbrewer.com, and I've attached an LED or a thermometer to it so that I can see what the temperature of the fermentation is doing. Okay, so that's the basics, and my goal here is to go through home brewing from a first-timer's experience with a first-timer's all-grain batch, and we'll see what happens. You can look down inside my mash tun and you can see that I've been using some hot water to heat the mash tun up, and so I don't lose as much heat when I start the mash process. And inside there is my stainless steel hose, my stainless steel braid to work as my, some mash tuns have a false bottom, some have different screening. This is the screening that I've used to help out. This is actually a 10-gallon Home Depot Rubbermaid cooler, and we'll see how it holds the temperature. And so how much water do I need? Well, one of the best assets out there is this website right here, howtobrew.com. All right, and it just goes over in great detail. It's by John Palmer, and it has almost all the detail that you need. And one of the nice, just handy rules of thumb that's out there is that for every pound of grain, you need 1.5 to 2 quarts of water. In general, it's sort of just a general rule of thumb for figuring out how much water you need in order to achieve the mash that you want, because the grain will absorb some of the water, and ultimately you want to end up with however many gallons of water that grain will support. So that's one of the ways to, just as a general rule of thumb, 1.5 to 2 quarts per pound of a mash beginning, between 150 and 155 degrees for an hour. All right, computing our mash and sparge water. I used brew365.com, right? I come down here, and ultimately I want a 5-gallon brew. So, and I added 10 pounds of grain. Boil time 60 minutes, 1 hour, right? Figure you're going to have some loss in the liquid at the bottom of the barrel of the boil kettle. You're going to lose some to your equipment, your mash thickness, that's your water to mash ratio, which is 1.33 quarts per pound. Grain temperature started at about 68. Oops, not 78, 68. Okay. Target mash temperature was 152. Constants, I'm not going to play with any of those. And then water needed, a total of 8.67 gallons needed. Right? Of those 8.67 gallons, I need 3.33 for the mash. The sparge, I need 5.34. My strike temperature, 164 degrees. Okay. My pre-warp boil. Okay, so in other words, the amount of liquid that I need to collect out of my mash tun when I'm done mashing, that's the total. after I'm done sparging and mashing is I should be about 6.3 gallons. Okay, so that's what I'm using to do my calculations right now. So I think I put a little bit more mash water in there than I had before, so I actually have about 3.5. So my sparge water, I'll probably need 5.2 gallons or whatever. All right, so that's roughly what we're going with, and this is my calculator. My sparge water temperature will be 170 degrees. So that's in the right temperature. Okay, so I'm getting ready to pour my mash water in here. It has reached the right temperature. It's called strike temperature. But the one thing you want to make sure is that your valve is in the off mode. Normally the off mode means that the handle is going across or 90 degrees to the body of the valve. So it's time to go get my strike water, to get my hot water and pour it into my mash tun and then start mashing the grain. All right, so here we go. Now, I don't have a fancy burner. I don't have a propane stove. I haven't done a turkey fryer. All I've got is a stove. Now that I have my water in there for my mash, I get to add my grain. I did go ahead and spend the $4 or $5 on the paddle. And to stir, it's important to stir because you don't want to have dough balls form with the grains as they go in. As you can see, it's sort of rafting up there at the top. And as I understand, my goal is to keep it from rafting so much that it creates big old honking dough balls. And really what we're doing is we're sort of making kind of an oatmeal, kind of a gruel, and ultimately the end product is really a barley tea, for lack of a better term. Okay, so just about have the whole grain bill in here. Seems like we have a good mix going on. Just under 4 gallons, which is right where the calculator said we needed to be. Let's go get the thermometer and figure this out. It's going to be tough to see this, but my water temperature is right now, it's at 152, which was the recommended temperature for mashing in. 152, 155. So we're going to put the lid on this and leave it alone for an hour. Okay, pros, some of you probably already noticed the mistake that I've made. What is it? Well, because my water is so soft, I need to use pH stabilizer, and I didn't put that in. This is my first home brew. I don't really care. I'm going to put it in now. One tablespoon for 5 gallons of water. Why is pH important? Because it's the pH helps determine how well you pull the sugars out of your mash, out of your malted barley. All right. So I'm just going to stir that in now. We're really still very early in our hour-long rest. What's the other thing I forgot to do? Set a timer. Fortunately, I think I'm only a few minutes into this mash. All right. And you might notice that there are 3 dogs running around. 2 Jack Russells and 1 boxer. The boxer's name is Kylie. This little one that just walked by is Zoe. And the other Jack Russell is Rusty. So there's the star sand that I'm using. It comes with their measuring device. It allows you to set the amount of star sand per unit. It's 1 ounce per 5 gallons, and I'm going to make about 2.5 gallons of sanitizing solution, and I'm just going to put it in my fermenter. Okay? I already have, hi Kylie, that's Kylie. I already have a squirt bottle already made with star sand that I've been using to sanitize stuff as I've gone. Right? So 2.5 gallons will stop, and we'll let our equipment for the day sanitize. Hey folks, while we were waiting on the mash, there's some things that I'm learning as we're going along, and I thought I would talk through that just a little bit. First off, mashing is just making barley tea. When you have the grain, the barley and the roasted barley and those types of things, when they're just sitting there without anything going on, they're really filled with a lot of starch. And then they do this thing called malting, which basically means they put the grain in a very high moisture environment and they let the grain begin to sprout. What happens then is that the grain begins to turn those starches and the sugars to help fuel the growth of the future plant. But you stop. They stop that growth process by raising the heat, stopping the process, and then and that's really what becomes malted grain. And then you can take that malted grain and you can roast it to get darker colors and different flavors and things like that. You can hear our dogs outside. So that's the malting process. And then you put them through a mill to grind them up and break them up so that you can make a better barley tea with them. And that barley tea helps activate certain enzymes that release the sugars into the water, into the tea. That barley tea is called wort in this whole process. So, to go over some of these high-speed, low-drag, special terms that they use in brewing, all-grain brewing means that you're not using some sort of syrup that was made from an all-grain brew. You're actually using the grain, and you're making your own barley tea, which is called a wort. You have you do your all-grain brewing in a thing called a mash tun, T-U-N, mash tun, and that is really a, hopefully, or in many cases, is an insulated cooler of some kind that you pour the water into. And based on certain calculations, the amount of grain and the amount that amount of heat that your mash tun is going to absorb, that determines the temperature of the water that you want to pour in. That temperature is called the strike temperature. All right, that's the temperature that you're going to start your mash with, because the process of pouring that water into the mash tun and then adding the grain will lower that temperature down to the temperature that you want it. Now the problem is that the conversion, the enzymes work in a very narrow temperature range. And so you need to really monitor that temperature, make sure that you're in the right spot to be sure that the mash is going to occur and that you're going to extract as much sugar as you possibly can, because that sugar ultimately feeds the yeast, that creates the alcohol that makes the beer that we want to drink. Okay, so that's the start of the whole mash process. So I have a recipe, but how do you read a beer recipe? I mean, that's a challenge as far as I'm concerned. How do you read this thing? How do you know what it is that you're making? You've got information over here on the original gravity and mash ingredients and boil additions and times and dry hopping, the different types of yeast that need to be used. And up here, you've got a mash schedule. It's talking about a single infusion mash, boil additions and times, and yeast and so on. So how do you read this? Well, I don't know. Okay, I'm new at this, but we're going to give it a shot. So when I was trying to figure out what my strike temperature was, I needed to know how much weight my grains were. So there I have 9 pounds of 2-row, which is just a generic, barley. And then I have 1 pound of caramel 40. The 40 indicates the level of the roast or the darkness and the color that's going to give to the final beer, and some of the roasted flavors that it's going to give to the beer. Okay. Now go up here, mash schedule. It says saccharine rest for 152 degrees for 60 minutes. What does that mean? That means that we're going to try to hit 152 degrees with the strike water. When we pour the strike water in, and then we pour the grains in and we mix it all in, we're supposed to try to get to around 152 degrees, right? Okay. And then mash out at 170 degrees. Okay. So we're going to drain the water off of the all grain batch here, but it's not going to be the amount of water we need to make 5 gallons of beer. Remember, we only put in less than 4 gallons of water to start with. And the grain is going to absorb some of that water. So we have to go back to a different calculator, and we'll show you that here in a second, and figure out how much water we need to rinse the rest of the sugar out of the grains. Now, the goal is to get the sugar, and we get that out of all the grains by we rinse the grains with water that's higher temperature so that it stops the it stops the conversion of the sugars, and then you rinse the rest of that out. And you don't want it to get too high, because then what you'll do is you'll pull in some of the off tasting flavors from the grain, and you don't want it to get too low either. All right, so it's got to be at the right temperature to be able to pull the sugars out, and that temperature is 170 degrees. All right, so that's what we know right now, and we'll worry about boil additions and times. Remember, you saw that entire hops load that we had laid out on the table. Well, this shows you that once we get the boil going properly, that we will add a 1/2 ounce of Centennial. That's a type of hops, right? We'll add a 1/2 ounce of Cascade. And we'll add another ounce of Cascade 20 minutes before the end. We'll add an ounce of Cascade 10 minutes before the end. We'll add 2 ounces of Citra, another type of hops, right at when we turn the heat off of the kettle and let it cool down some. And we just let it sit there for 10 minutes. Okay, then we cool everything off. Now, if you look at the recipe, all right, it's calling for 2 weeks in a primary, 2 weeks in a secondary fermentation, and then 2 weeks for bottle conditioning. So we're going to keep everything 2 weeks in a primary fermenting vessel, right? And when we jump to this 2 weeks in a secondary, that's when we dry hop. Okay, and we'll add some dry hops to that, and those dry hops are 1 ounce of Citra and 1 ounce of Cascade. Okay, and the yeast that we're using today is going to be a dry yeast. Now, there's a difference between dry yeast and liquid yeast, and that's a whole series of YouTube videos that are out there for that. But basically, with the dry yeast, all we're going to do is hydrate it right before we pitch it in, and that means we're going to get some sterilized water. We're going to heat it up to around 100 degrees, not more than that. Certainly not more than 105, or we'll kill the yeast off. And pour the yeast in, get it hydrated, wake it up, get it all ready to roll. Okay, and then we will add that to our fermenting vessel. with our wort. What's wort again? Wort is just barley tea, and it's the sugars that we are able to withdraw from the grains. Okay? Right, so we do have one problem. I'm a dad, and we have a busy schedule. And so today we have a football meeting, and that football meeting kicks off right at the end of the mash. So what do I do? Well, I can't plan my day any better. And so I went to the Fount of All Knowledge YouTube and found that it's okay to leave a mash go for a little bit long. All right? It's not the best, but it's okay. So we're going to let the mash go until I can get back. When I get back, then we'll get our kettles going. We'll heat up our sparge water, which is the water you rinse the grains with after you're done with the mash. All right? We'll heat up our sparge water, and then we'll go through the process of filling the boil kettle and getting that going. All right? So stay tuned.